Hello, and welcome to a Sunny Book Nook. My name is Sunny, and I am here to bring you a book to movie, movie to book recommendations list, basically based off of an A24 produced movie. I'm going to give you a couple books that I think fit a similar vibe. So if you like the movie, or if you liked what the movie was going for, then pick up the book, essentially. So, let's just get straight into it because I have a lot of movies on my list. My laptop is here with my notes app list, opened up. So, the first movie I want to talk about, also, quite a few of these movies are like 2022 releases as well, so pretty relevant. And a lot of these movies are some of like my favorites of the past year, as well as like perhaps even of all time. And some of them are just like not as good, but we'll get into that when we get to that. So, the first book I want to talk about, or actually, I'm gonna go movies and then books. So, the first movie I want to talk about is Bodies, 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 a 2022 movie that stars Rachel Sennett, Pete Davidson, Amandla Stenberg. Amazing cast. They're all so fucking talented, and this movie is so fantastic in my opinion. Like, it's kind of a fucking brilliant movie in the way that it also, wait, I forgot to mention, my little dino here is joining me as a friend as I speak about these books, because I do move my hands a lot and I need to hold something or do something with my hands when I am not holding a book, I think. I think that would be good for me. Anyways, so Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. Great movie. I fucking loved it. I saw it multiple times in theaters. It was such a fun experience. I laughed. I was on the edge of my seat. I was like wanting to yell at the screen. Everyone in the theater was also like seated as fuck as well. Like, everyone was like, OMG, what's gonna happen? What's up? I think one of the reasons why the writing of this movie and the dialogue is so brilliant is because it is written by Kristen Rupinian. So actually this first book movie recommendation situation is like kind of obvious if you paid attention to the writing credits at the end of the movie, but anyways, because the book I want to attach to it is Kristen Rupinian's short story collection, Cat Person and Other Stories. If you remember back like 5-10 years ago, there was a New Yorker story called Cat Person by Kristen Rupinian that went really viral. And this is obviously a collection of that story and along with a lot of her other short stories. And I think the way she incisively interrogates young people's relationships with each other through mediums of like technology as well as self-obsession and reflection within, dynamics and sexual and romantic relationships and friendships and such as is really shown and very strong in both Bodies, Bodies, Bodies as a movie, because the movie is adopted from a story that Rupinian wrote, as well as in this collection of short stories. So I think that if you liked Bodies, 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 you should definitely check out the short story collection. If you are down to be uncomfortable in the way that Bodies, Bodies, Bodies makes you uncomfortable, I guess. And I think Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is also a very funny movie. The way that the characters and the actors deliver their lines are so on point. So, yeah, there's that. And then another 2022 release that was fantastic and that everyone's been raving about is Everything Everywhere All at Once, of course, which I also watched. Oh, also, Bodies, 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 me and my podcast co-host slash best friend did a review episode on our podcast, Lavender Menace, if you want to check that out. And Everything Everywhere All at Once, we also did a review episode of. I saw it in theaters sort of before people were talking about it, just saying, but after watching that movie and sitting in the experience of that for like, 6 months to a year now, I feel like there are some books that you should check out if you're interested in the type of weird genre bending absurdist narrative that Everything Everywhere All at Once has. So the first book I want to talk about that I think mirrors Everything Everywhere All at Once pretty well is Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. This book is a science fiction, fantasy, magical realism set in our contemporary real world novel, similar to the setting of Everything Everywhere All at Once. There are these aliens who are refugees from like a space war who now run a donut shop in like LA or something, and then their story intersects with a homeless trans girl running away from home who then becomes the student of a prodigy violinist teacher who has sold her soul to the devil and needs to sacrifice a seventh young prodigy violinist to the devil in order for her to earn her soul back. So it's like these different intersecting storylines with these characters who end up having to have these complex relationships with each other, and it's about like found family and love and connection among the universe within this funny and heartwarming context that is absurd but accepts the absurdity as the reality. And of course, it's about Asian American women and their stories and the way that they deal with global capitalist orders and the mundanities of day-to-day life and trying to just survive, you know? And so I think that if you liked Everything Everywhere All at Once, you should definitely pick up this book if you're into that sort of thing. I also think that another absurd narrative that kind of feels similar to Everything Everywhere All at Once is The Hike by Drew Marguerite, because in this book we follow this guy who goes to this work retreat and then he goes on a hike before, you know, the work conference happens. And then on the hike, shit gets really weird. And the whole book is about him on this hike where he keeps on running into these talking crabs and fucking this ship and like this faceless man and this dog that's chasing after him and all these scary ass things, you know, elements of his past. Like there are definitely elements of alternate realities of this man's life throughout the course of this book, and all those science fiction-y, absurdist, almost humorous elements that are also kind of scary and also action-packed are definitely found in a lot of the scenes in this book. And I think that it also has a sort of existential vibe to it that Everything Everywhere All at Once gives you, but the way that it's all about family and connection and grief and love is also what ties the core narratives of these two stories together for me personally as things that I would recommend in tandem with each other. And another book that I would recommend in relationship to Everything Everywhere All at Once is Temporary by Hilary Leichter. This book is very weird and funny and almost lighthearted, but it's about this woman who takes on a bunch of different temp jobs as a barnacle on a ship, as a girlfriend, as a house cleaner, as all these different things, and it's sort of like she jumps into different realities essentially as this temp working at this agency, and we kind of just have to go with the flow of everything that's going on because her reality is so different yet accepted as so mundane and as the natural course of the things that are happening to her as a worker. And of course it's a commentary on contemporary capitalist work culture and the absurdity of it and the interchangeability of people within it. And I think like those themes also connect these two narratives pretty well, although Temporary is definitely, it's less actiony and more kind of avant-garde in like a Dadaist almost way. Like it's kind of silly and free, but also high art, if that makes sense. So that's that. Then another A24 movie that came out a few years ago that I really enjoyed is The Farewell, directed by Lulu Wang. And this movie is all about this Chinese American woman who goes back to China with her family and has to pretend to not know that her grandma is dying. And it's all about this, you know, matrilineal line of relationships and a cross-cultural diasporic sort of struggle, but in this quiet and moving and grounded way. The humor and absurdity of family, and it's beautifully shot and directed, and the way that it uses language and translation is very, very gorgeous to me. And a book that sort of reminds me of their farewell is Blackwater Sister by Zen Cho. This is a different genre because this is like science fiction fantasy-esque, but it is also about a young Asian American woman who has graduated college and is going back to her parents' home country with her family because of extended family situations. And when she is there, she ends up becoming almost haunted or possessed by some sort of spirit and is able to communicate with and speak to her dead grandmother, her mother's mother. And I think that, matrilineal line and relationship between this young Asian woman struggling with her identity and selfhood and her place in the world is really what connects these two narratives together for me. Although definitely Blackwater Sister is much more campy and raucous and sci-fi-esque, and kind of almost there's like a mystery narrative to it because she's really trying to uncover what the fuck is going on with this company and the religious practices and her family and all of this stuff. But I think like that sort of narrative really makes these two pieces of media work well together, and that makes them connect to each other in my mind. Also, I would say Brown Girls by Daphne Andreades. This book sort of takes on the we voice about these young women and girls who grew up in, I think, Queens and New York City, and their experiences being in diasporic communities and their relationships to their mothers and communities. And I think that narrative through line is also what connects these two stories, because The Farewell is also, I think, grounded in the fact that our main character, played by Awkwafina, is living in New York. And so that was a similarity that I kind of drew between, but it's sort of a weaker link and recommendation pairing than I think Blackwater Sister, even though they are more similar tonally in their somberness and the genre of just like the literary realism feeling, if that makes sense. Just thematically, it's a little bit more different, if that makes sense. But a little bit more off base, But I still think they're related. And then the next movie I want to talk about is The Green Knight, which also came out a couple years ago. And this movie is a retelling of an Arthurian tale, and it is gorgeous. It's a beautiful, beautiful, lush movie, and I really enjoyed my experience with it. It's so sensory, submerges you in the historical period and time and environment of that setting, I think. And so I was really thinking about books that do that for you. And there actually is a book that does an Arthurian retelling called Spear by Nicola Griffith, but I don't have my physical copy with me. I think I talked about it in my mid-year favorites of 2022. I let my friend borrow it. She still hasn't read it, but she still has it, so Anyways, that book is a retelling of an Arthurian legend, but this time it's sort of gender bent it, and so now our main character is like this butch lesbian, and she sort of has to go undercover as a man, and she lives in like the wilderness with her mom, and she like has to go on this hero's journey essentially. But the Green Knight obviously doesn't follow that character, it follows the Green Knight. I think like that historical vibe and that really immersive setting, as well as a main character who we follow through the entire course of the story is a very similar parallel here, as well as, of course, Arthurian legend. So I think this is a very spot on recommendation pairing. But something that's a little bit more removed is Matrix by Lauren Groff, which is a lesbian nun retelling of history, or it's sort of like a fictionalized version of history in like the 13th or 12th century or something, some shit like that. And essentially, we follow this woman as she gets expelled from the Versailles Palace as a bastardess and moves to the Abbey in northern France where everyone is starving. And she runs that shit in like the Navy. She whips them into shape. You know what? Like, and you gotta respect it. So I think that book, in the way that it tells and portrays spirituality, magic, mysticism within the context of this immersive historical environment, following our main character throughout the entire course of the narrative, is also similar to The Green Knight in that way. So I think that's another thing. That's another book that I really, really enjoyed when I read it a couple years ago. And Spear is also a great short novella, and I would definitely recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about was also a 2022 release, but it was not a good movie. I'm just putting it on the list because I think that there are some books that can perhaps tackle what this movie is trying to do in a way that is better than what the movie accomplished. And the movie that I'm talking about is Men. Men is a horror film that is not very successful. It obviously has to do with like male violence and patriarchy, but it follows this woman who is in an isolated like British countryside setting, and she starts having these like strange interactions with this guy who keeps on trying to break into her house. And then she's trying to deal with that shit, but she's like the only person in the house, and she's there because she has just experienced something pretty traumatic. It's her trying to cope and get away from everything, essentially. But the movie at the beginning was like pretty solid, in my opinion, but then towards the end I was like, what the fuck is going on? No. But a book that I think was pretty solid at the beginning, and then by the end I was also like, this is really good, but it also got pretty crazy, is Mona by oloixarac. I have no clue how to say this woman's last name. And I also have a physical copy of this, but my friend is also borrowing it right now, I'm pretty sure. Or I can't find the copy. Either way, this book is also a look at a specific environment in which a woman, our main character, interacts with like men. She's at a literary conference. She's trying to see who's gonna win the fucking award. There's all these guys from all over the world who are also writers, and our main character hails from a Latin American country, and it's an interesting story, but it gets pretty weird towards the end. She is in this like haze of being high off via her dab pen the whole fucking time at the conference. She has the dread and self removal, isolation, and emotional disconnect of someone who has experienced violence and trauma in a way that I think our main character in Men also does, except Mona does it a lot more successfully, I think. And they are also in a somewhat remote and isolated context. Although, of course, it's not just one woman in like a small town that she's not familiar with. It's a bunch of these different writers at a conference in like Greenland or some shit, Iceland or whatever. And it's like a lot about the way that these people interact with each other and the conversations they have and how bullshit the literary scene is, right? Whereas I think thematically Men tries to get at how bullshit the gender dynamics of this like world is, but it doesn't really do it that successfully, but yeah, whatever. Mona, I think, was a really solid book, and it is, I think, a comparable recommendation to Men if you want something that's like better than that and more specific in the way that it tackles issues of like gender violence in relationships and how that reflects into the real world with a touch of like almost surrealist horror. Although Mona is less horror than just literary realism, I would say. I would also recommend Little Eyes by Samantha Schweblin. This is a horror speculative fiction book that is about these little robots that like spy on people, and each chapter we get insight on different people's lives as seen through the eyes of the observers inside the robots, or vice versa. It's pretty interesting, and I think the way that this book addresses issues of like gender violence has a similar tonal, unsettling vibe to Men without like the weird body horror evolution of it. And yeah, I mean, I also think Little Eyes is a book that explores themes of like technology and isolation in a way that I think Men try to do at the beginning of the movie, also unsuccessfully, in my opinion. Pick this up if that sounds interesting to you. The other A24 horror movie historical period drama I want to talk about is The Lighthouse. And this movie I saw in theaters with my friends when it came out like a few years ago at this point, and it was weird as fuck. But I enjoyed it. I had a good time. It is shot in black and white on film. We're set in this really isolated setting of obviously a lighthouse. These two sailors who get drunk with each other every night, live in these terrible, harsh conditions, have to tend to the lighthouse. It's this tiny, tiny, tiny island of just rocks and seagulls and bird shit everywhere. And they gradually descend into madness and hallucinations, and their relationship gets more and more aggressive as the movie progresses, and it is fascinating. I think that a book that really reminds me of this movie, honestly, is mcglue by Tessa Moshfegh. This is a really short novella. It is set in the mid-19th century in Salem, Massachusetts. So it's also in like the Northeast in like the 19th century, which is the time period in which the lighthouse is set. But it's about this drunk sailor also who has been accused of murdering his best friend. So like very similar parallels here, honestly. And tonally, like he is going through a lot of shit, and he is a disgusting person. And we see in the lighthouse these two men be so fucking disgusting with each other, and that's obviously the point, and the point of mcglue is also that as well. But there's also a homoeroticism that is present in both of these pieces of media that I think is a similar through line, and I think that there is another similar through line of like violence against like women and minorities sort of on the peripheral in these men's minds, as well as the way that their relationships to each other as friends. He's sort of waking up in drunken flashbacks as he gets in jail and wakes up on the boat and whatever, as he experiences these things, and he doesn't really know what's fact and what's fiction, what's real and what's not. And we as the audience, while watching the movie and while reading this, like can't tell either. And that's why what I think is so brilliant about the use of narrative and storytelling in these pieces of media. And next, the modern classic A24 horror movie, Midsommar. Oh my god, wait, I'm not wearing earrings, and I have Midsommar earrings. Let me go fucking get those. Do y'all see that shit? Isn't that so fucking cute? My friend slash Oomphy Bay mutual at Bad Basement on Instagram and Twitter makes this horror themed polymer clay earring jewelry. You should definitely check out her shop if you like the vibe of this. But anyways, so Midsommar, that is a pretty interesting movie on cults and grief and indoctrination. And actually, if you want to read more about my thoughts on cults, Midsommar is a movie, books that I think also deal with cults as it relates to Midsommar and stuff, you should read my Substack cults essay that I published back in August of 2022 if you haven't already. Anyways, this movie, if you haven't heard of it, I mean, it is an aesthetically beautiful and bright and floral horror movie that uses sunlight, entrancing dances and white dresses and traditional Nordic folklorish vibes to bring you as the audience in and you as the viewer in to a horrifying situation, but that feels inescapable and is inescapable actually. And that really makes me think of the book Watch Over Me by Nina LaCour. This is a young adult magical realism novel. It is not horror, but the way that this book is also about a main character suffering with grief and loss and like her family burning in a fire, you know, like that type of shit. She goes to this camp or like this rehabilitation facility, sort of isolationist, like living on the land type retreat, like farm in the middle of nowhere with these like nice old people who like, you know, help foster a bunch of these kids and teens. And she there has to find hope and healing and community and solace. And she ends up interacting with like ghosts on the farm and having to help the other children there. And it is quite moving and beautiful and ethereal, but I think like it's really the themes of grief and isolation and, you know, coming to terms with that in a natural setting within a cult-like situation that I think makes these two pieces of media pretty similar and parallel. I mention in my cults essay, actually, the book Florida Woman by Deb Rogers, which I include a review of an analysis in a comparative text analysis review in this Substack essay. But Florida Woman is about this Florida woman who, in order to get out of prison, does this like stint at a monkey rehab facility in like the jungles of Florida with these three women who are running it as a up and coming haven for monkeys. And shit is going on and it's weird, and we kind of see throughout the process of the book our main character understanding more and more of what the fuck is going on, because at first it feels idyllic and then it becomes pretty sinister in a way that is similar to Midsommar. And of course the integration of this natural surrounding and this sort of dark unsurety of the relationships with the people who are already there and familiar with and integrated into the surrounding and the community and help build it. And the dynamic of being a visitor or intruder or outsider is also explored in Florida Woman in a way that I think is pretty fascinating and parallel. And speaking of Florida, the next A24 movie that I want to talk about is The Florida Project. And this movie is a really good movie, honestly. And I have talked about this movie in relationship to Florida by Lauren Groff in my first A24 movie to book recommendation video that I made him put up like 3 years ago at this point, 3 or 4 years ago. That shit is crazy. Honestly, don't even watch that video because I'm sure A, I look awful, B, I'm not talking eloquently, and C, yeah, no. But essentially, I think the way that Lauren Groff explores stories of family, poverty, the natural landscape of Florida, the way that violence throughout people's relationships plays out in this setting of Florida throughout these short stories, very similar to The Florida Project as a movie. And I think that something about The Florida Project that is so unique about that movie is how candy-like it is, right? Because it's set right outside of Disney World, and so much of Disney World is about this false sense of, you know, like it's an amusement park. It's something that you have to pay a lot of money for to have a good time at. And that is what makes me want to recommend Swamplandia by Karen Russell in conjunction with The Florida Project as a movie, because Swamplandia is the name of an amusement park that the family that this book centers upon runs. But at the very beginning of the book, we find out that Swamplandia is closing down and not really running the way that it should be running anymore due to a series of events, including the death of the mother and matriarch of this family. And then we follow these young siblings as they all experience varying levels of like psychosis in trying to cope with everything that's going on. And of course, the isolation and the toxic parent-child weird relationships, and then the adult child fucked up relationships, and then this natural landscape of this like semi-natural just concrete landscape of Florida, and the murky, salty, swampy heat of it that emanates off of the screen in the Florida Project is also seen here in Swamplandia, I think. So these are two pieces of media that really go down together, in my opinion. This book is a very richly written text, honestly. Like, it's pretty dense. You could really sink your teeth into it. But trigger warning for kind of weird anti-indigenous shit throughout, because like one of the things about this family, they're all white, is that they pretend to be native as like a part of their family tradition. Whatever. It's addressed within the context of this book because they're essentially like white trash type descendants of settler-esque families, in the way that in the Florida Project, like we see a single mom living in a motel, and like the way that being white trash in Florida outside of a really famous amusement park sort of dictates the lives of these children. So we get the perspective of Florida and the Florida projects through the eyes of these young children. And in Swamplandia, most of the perspectives that we get are through the young children. Like, actually, the whole book is through the perspectives of the young girl and her brother as they try to navigate being sort of abandoned and listless in the world. Finally, I have another 2022 release. Wait, was it 2022? No, it was 2021 release called Zola. And me and my podcast co-host Renaissance also talked about this movie on our podcast, so you can check that out if you want to. But Zola follows this young woman who gets roped into like a sex trafficking scheme almost when she's working at a strip club, and it is based off of a series of like a tweet thread that dropped like 10 years ago that blew up the internet. And the movie itself is really ostentatious and bold and glitzy, but in this dark sort of way, similar to, I think, the cheap glamour of an aestheticized Miami almost that we see throughout this movie. And I think the themes of like sex work and gendered exploitation in this particular way are conveyed, and also the fact that it's like autobiographical essentially, or it's a portrayal of something that happened to a real life woman in the 2010s, is parallel to a memoir / autobiography that I read called Camgirl by mazzei, where she talks about being a cam girl and getting into camming and all the steps that led her there. So obviously there's that obvious parallel. But then there is a thriller that is also very high stakes, like people's lives are on the line in Zola the movie, and in this young adult thriller, The Girls I've Been, people's lives are on the fucking line because they are in a hostage situation, and we are following our main character as she recollects all the different ways that she has had to take on different identities in order to survive, and she's been roped into it by another person. And the fundamental aspect of Zola as a story is that our main character has been roped into doing all this shit by another person. It is quite fascinating and fun in like a dark, twisty, dreadful way, if that makes sense. But yeah, those are all of the book recommendations based off of A24 movies. I know A24 is just like a production and distribution company, I'm pretty sure. So it's more of like a brand and a vibe more so than a description of what, like, how the quality of a movie, you know? Because it's not like describing the director of a movie or even like the actor or the writers or whoever are involved in the making of something. But like, yeah, I mean, I think like when you say A24 movie, people have an understanding of what the fuck you're talking about. So that's why that's what this video is about. And also, this whole list of movies I'm talking about are all distributed by A24. So anyways, that is the book recommendation to movie list I am talking about today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this was insightful to you. I hope these parallels and connections made sense to you in a way that made sense to me. But let me know in the comments if they did or did not, or if you have any other movie to book recommendations that came to mind for you while I was blabbering on here for like 45 minutes. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Bye!